Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Cavan-Smith. Tonight, Chamisa is a shoo-in. Zimbabwe's main opposition party elects Nelson Chamisa as leader at the MDC's first Congress since the death of its founder, Morgan Tsvangirai, last year. Also, Madagascar holds parliamentary polls in another showdown between President Andry Rajoelina and his bitter rival, Marc Ravalomanana. Voters appear to be less than enthusiastic, though, about taking part in the process. We hear from our correspondent on the ground. And the downfall of Sudan's Omar al-Bashir last month has led other regional leaders to become a bit worried. Some analysts believe Chad's Idris Deby has agreed to keep Ramadan prices fixed when they normally see a hike because of concerns that the social movement that brought down his Sudanese neighbour could become contagious. We take a closer look. But first, in Zimbabwe, opposition leader Nelson Chamisa has retained his leadership of the Movement for Democratic Change. The party held a three-day congress over the weekend in the central city of Gweru. Now, the MDC's it's the first time the MDC has held a congress like this since the death of its founder, Morgan Tsvangirai, last February. The MDC's been riven by infighting ever since. Chamisa took over before losing presidential elections to current leader Emmerson Mnangagwa last year. He's vowed to modernise the party, which long contested the rule of ousted former strongman Robert Mugabe. Ryan Truscott joins us now with more. Ryan, so Chamisa's held on. Does that suggest that after the Congress, the MDC is any more unified than we've seen it recently?
I think that's the hope. I mean, voting took place through the night last night, despite a power cut in the stadium where the Congress took place, and some interesting things did emerge. We saw two women elevated into what's known as the top six. So Lynette Karenyi is now one of the three vice presidents, and Tabitha Kumalo is MDC national chairperson. In the past, Nelson Chamisa has been criticized for sidelining women, so it looks like an attempt to at least partly address that concern. What we're also seeing is several MDC officials who had not all that long ago left the party now coming back and being given senior positions. So Tendai Biti is one of them. He broke away from the MDC over differences with Morgan Tsvangirai back in 2014. He's now one of the new vice presidents. Welshman Nube and David Coulthard are both prominent lawyers. They parted ways with Tsvangirai back in 2005. Welshman Nube is now one of the new vice presidents. He's long been a respected political figure here. Crucially, he's also Ndebele, and representation for that ethnic group is a very important aspect to any political party in Zimbabwe. So I think what we've seen here is a strong team emerging, capable of uniting the party perhaps. And of course, we don't know if there'll be bitterness from those who haven't got the positions that they wanted.
So it looks like the MDC is pulling together a bit more strongly than it has over the last year or so, at the very least. And Chamisa's vowed to teach the ruling ZANU-PF party a lesson. Are we likely to see any change in the way that the MDC interacts with Emmerson Mnangagwa's government?
Look, I think what many want to know is, will the MDC want to hold protests? I mean, there's growing frustration here over the economic crisis. We've got rising prices, we've got power shortages and fuel shortages and rising inflation. And all of these are a terrible burden faced by ordinary people, though the government says that a measure of austerity is needed to repair the damage done to the economy in the last nearly 4 decades. The MDC issued a number of resolutions today at the end of the Congress, and it talked about defending the people of Zimbabwe, including the right to hold protests. There were no dates given, of course, but I think those kinds of phrases will be closely watched, not least by the government of Zimbabwe. Remember, back in January, there were protests and looting, and that led to the death of 12 people. The MDC insists that Mnangagwa didn't win the 2018 election, and it's refused to go to an inter-party dialogue that he organized earlier this month. Will the party get support if it holds protests? That we don't know. We don't know if people have the energy, if they're afraid, if mitigatory measures by the government are things like cheap bus fares, whether those are going to work. And like everywhere, there's a lot of fake news going around. The main Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions today had to dispel rumors that it had called for a general strike.
Thanks very much. Ryan Truscott there for us in Harare. Now, Malawi's president has been re-elected. The results from last week's vote were released on Monday, giving Peter Mutharika a slim lead over opposition leader Lazarus Chakwera with 38.57% of ballots. Chakwera had obtained a temporary injunction on the final count after accusing Mutharika's camp of rigging the vote. He claimed that his party's count showed that he was ahead and that there were irregularities in the ballots from 10 out of 28 districts, including vote tallying sheets where the numbers had reportedly been Tipexed out and changed. The EU observer mission, though, has said that the election campaign was well managed, transparent and inclusive. Madagascar held parliamentary polls on Monday in another showdown between President Andry Rajoelina and his bitter rival Marc Ravalomanana. 810 MPs are in the race for 151 seats, and the party with the most seats gets to name the Prime Minister. After several years of political turbulence amongst the same faces, voters appear to be less than enthusiastic about taking part in the process, though. Gael Borgia tells us more.
Turnout appeared to be low. Independent observer group Safidi estimated that by noon participation was only 25%. Yet candidates of the president's ERD party pulled out all the stops during the last 3 weeks of electoral campaign and spent big trying to win support. Flyers were handed out door to door, donations and concerts were organized. President Rajoelina made several official visits around the country and announced big projects like the promise to build new roads and offer financial help to young entrepreneurs. But all those efforts appear to have failed to whip up voters' enthusiasm. President Rajoelina still hopes to win a majority of legislative seats to implement his presidential program. He's facing 109 candidates of the opposition party of former President Marc Ravalomanana, who lost the presidential election. There are also 500 independent candidates with no party. And growing frustration of voters with the political dominance of Rajoelina and Ravalomanana's parties could generate political instability and give power to independents. And both presidential and opposition parties would have to bargain for backing to get the majority votes needed to bring in new laws. Civil society figures fear that could lead to backroom negotiations, coalitions and corruption, a particularly worrisome prospect as many of the outgoing deputies are facing allegations of graft.
Gael Borgia there for us. Well, Sudanese protest leaders have called for a two-day general strike to start on Tuesday to ramp up pressure on the military council to transfer power to a civilian authority. Generals removed former longtime leader Omar al-Bashir from power last month, and a sit-in has been held by demonstrators outside of military headquarters in Khartoum since. To insist on a transition of power. Negotiations, though, have been slow. Both protesters and the army have agreed to a 3-year handover period, but talks have stalled over the makeup and leadership of the Sovereign Council that would take over during that time. Splits have also appeared within the pro-democracy movement, as a leading opposition party has said that it will not be joining in Tuesday's strike. Now, the downfall of Omar al-Bashir has had effects throughout the region. In neighbouring Chad, President Idris Déby's government recently announced that the prices of basic staples would be fixed during Ramadan. Now, it's a time when prices usually see a rise. And some analysts think that Déby's worried that the social movement that brought down his Sudanese neighbour could become contagious. Nicolas Chamal tells us more.
The shops in Chad that are taking part in the operation called The Right Price have put up these posters. Prices often surge during Ramadan. To limit inflation, the government and the Chamber of Commerce have fixed the price of certain basic products.
C'est une initiative qui était propre aux commerçants.
The initiative was launched by shopkeepers. They were tired of being blamed for all of the Chadian problems, so they formed a group and came to see us at the Chamber of Commerce. And with our help, they launched the operation called The Right Price.
Groups close to the opposition called it a political maneuver.
With this operation, They are playing to the gallery. I mean it. Shopkeepers are angry right now. They weren't consulted. And it's during Ramadan that they usually raise the prices of basic food products.
Some analysts believe President Idriss Déby launched this campaign because of what happened in neighbouring Sudan. In April, his counterpart Omar al-Bashir was toppled by the army following huge protests that were initially about the price of bread. The relationship between the two leaders had greatly improved in recent years after a period when they had been supporting each other's rebel groups. Omar al-Bashir was president for 3 decades. Idriss Déby is not far behind. He has now been in power for 29 years.
And finally, hundreds of people turned out to greet a returning hero in Johannesburg on Monday. Sarai Khumalo is the first black African woman to summit Mount Everest and was met with song and dance as she arrived home at Tambo International Airport. The business executive reached the top of the world's highest mountain earlier this month and has said that her achievement, she hopes, should inspire all Africans. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. We'll be back in about 45 minutes with more. Take care.
From the late 70s for almost a decade, Italy was terrorised by the years of lead. The May '68 student movements morphed into political violence and terrorism. Armed groups on the far right and the extreme left, like the Red Brigades, bombed, kidnapped and murdered. Almost 400 people died. This January, after 40 years spent eluding the authorities, the far-left militant Cesare Battisti was arrested in Bolivia, confessing to 4 murders. Our reporters have been to Rome to meet the families demanding justice for the victims and that this dark period not be forgotten.
The Italian years of lead revisited, all this week on France 24.